So, welcome back to Silmarillion Total War and to another battle replay and to another new patch. It seems like every time there's an update and a new faction added to Silmarillion, I get a clutch of battle replays that Lord of Belagost points me in the direction to. It's become something of a regularity now, which is good actually, because it means that there are always spikes of content when Silmarillion does have something new to offer. And that is the case this time, albeit this is for something which has been in the works really for quite a while at this point. Three whole factions have had their complete development cycle come and go, while these guys, the Naugrim of Luin, the forefathers of the dwarves, have been waiting for their chance really, and development has been ongoing for them. Given that Silmarillion is what it is in terms of the balance that it has set up, I suppose having a more heavy infantry focused faction like this is not exactly the norm. There are relatively few factions that behave in this way, and you can't exactly have the dwarves be a carbon copy of the way Angband do things, because they won't have access to monsters or the like. But yeah, we'll get to see the Naugrim in action at long last. Three Naugrim armies will be facing off against varying factions that were already in the game, which will be arrayed against them, including the Grey Elves over there, who were the faction that were added just before them, of course. So hopefully with three Dwarven armies as well, we'll get to see a good array of them. I have actually already recorded a battle with Naugrim, but on Lord of Belagost's recommendation, and considering he was a part of all of these battle replays and pointed me towards them, this is the one we'll be seeing first. The next one we'll be seeing, the one I've already recorded, is more of a field battle. So the dwarves in a more open sense, this one obviously being much more of a siege focused thing, with the bridge as well being a major factor. And the third in this little run of battles that we're going to be showing off is a replay on Gondolin. So it'll be interesting to see how the dwarves perhaps behave in a siege when they're fighting alongside other factions rather than just other armies of Naugrim. This is the kind of map, however, that the dwarves should do quite well on, because it gives them plenty of opportunity to dig in and utilise their heavy infantry and obviously their front lines. Naturally, the dwarves are going to be good at certain things. Many ages may have passed between the dwarves of the Third Age and the Naugrim here, but ultimately there are still going to be some very significant similarities that we're going to see. But there are also going to be some pretty significant omissions as well from their roster. You know, certain things you expect with the dwarves, they're fairly predictable in what they are, but of course within the Silmarillion meta we shall see how this kind of approach behaves. We shall be starting off with Tundra's Fox's army. Now normally we go through the attackers first and foremost, but we'll go through the dwarves now because I want to spend a little bit more time speaking about the dwarven units as we go through them. If you want to skip all of this spiel and get right on with the battle, the timestamp will be in the description below. So Tundra's Fox, he has got some axe throwers of some miners of Nogrod and some axe throwers of Nogrod here mixed in together. So these Nogrod units are more or less the rank and file of Luin, as they were. The axe throwers should be rather straightforward in what they offer. We've already seen throwing projectiles. Not going to go through all of the mechanics of Silmarillion once again, because we've been through that many times at this point. But yes, basic axe throwers though they may be, they're still going to be very capable of dealing damage, and of course they make for a really good supporting tool potentially as well for those solid dwarven front lines. The miners of Nogrod as well being the sort of basic line infantry unit that the Naugrim can field. Nothing too special, but obviously they will have, for a very basic entry level unit, the dwarven twist on things, with the fact that they're going to be just that little bit more resilient with regards to those armour values as well. In the middle of things over here we have some chariots, which, yes, the Iron Legion engineers, you can see that they do actually use the same model as the chariots over in Reforged at the moment, or at least the chariots themselves do. I don't know whether this will change. I would imagine that maybe ponies would be replacing the war goats at some stage, but for now, as they are, we see that the crew members at the very least have changed. But mechanically I think it's a very similar thing, where chariots, if you keep them moving, they'll do very well for you. If they get bogged down, they can die off very, very quickly. The crossbows on the back, however, are going to be very, very damaging. Speaking of which, we won't be able to see the crossbows just yet, but we will see some Dragon Slayers of Azagal. So you can see here with a wicked-looking axe, as well as some adorned shields as well. Nice aggressive unit of slightly higher tier line infantry this. We'll be able to see them, all of these various units in action, and we'll see how well they perform relative to the units they're facing off against. But yeah, the Dragon Slayers here are going to be a more damaging unit than the basic Nogrod units that are alongside them here. More miners here, so more of a rank and file approach this by Tundra's Fox by the looks of things. Lots of Nogrod units. We've also got the Beast Hunters over here, which trade in their shield for a second hand axe, so they'll be a little bit more damaging in melee, but they'll be a little bit more vulnerable to various forms of missile attacks. So there we have it. Yeah, lots of the basic Nogrod units, some Dragon Slayers over here, and also some hidden units way over here in the back, waiting for their opportunity to strike. Another couple of units of Beast Hunters, so hoping that his massive army means those guys go undetected, I suppose. But it's going to be interesting to see how the baseline Dwarven units perform in this kind of situation, because that's clearly what Tundra's Fox is hedging his bets on. Farkin, on the other hand, is not doing that. He has instead got some Life Ward Hewers of Ered Luin. These Life Ward units are the upper crust, as it were, in comparison to the Nogrod ones, and the Life Hewers, of course, being a two-handed axe unit, going to be very deadly at dealing with armoured units. The Dwarves themselves may have liberal use of armour, but it takes one to know one, and they need to know how to counteract armour, and that is exactly what they have here. Over here we have the foot-bound crossbows, the Iron Arbalists of Balagost. Interestingly enough, this is only the second faction to have access to crossbows in Silmarillion so far, the other of course being Angband with their iron shots. And crossbows, with their stopping power, with their base damage, can be a very effective tool, especially when the enemy are unable to avoid coming into range before they can attack. Of course, lower range does mean that they can be pushed around a little bit, especially with some of the Elven factions having really good range on their archers, so the Dwarves do need to be a little bit wary of that, especially given their slightly less mobile nature as a faction overall. But in this kind of situation, this is exactly where the crossbow should come in. Very, very useful. And if they do engage in a skirmish fight, you may notice they also have a shield with them as well, so they are going to be a little bit more resilient than the crossbows that we've seen from Angband. Not too surprising to see that from the Dwarves though. Down here we have some Iron Guardsmen of Balagost in and amongst some Iron Halberdiers of Balagost, so this once again some upper tier mainline units for the Dwarves. Halberdiers, of course, are somewhat rare. Any polearm unit, generally speaking in Silmarillion, the meta isn't entirely based around having these anchoring units, but when you do have them, especially in a situation like this, the Naugrim should do very well out of this with a nice unit of line infantry alongside them. This is going to be a very effective front line, especially if the units coming up against them are armoured, because the armour piercing on those halberds should come in very handy. More of these Iron Arbalists, so he has invested quite a lot in these crossbows as Farkin, and they're not cheap and they're not numerous either when you consider there's 63 in a unit over here, but yeah, I mean, they're damaging, especially when you mass them up like that. They should do quite well for themselves. Now, we have the Lifewood Pikemen of Ered Luin as well, so they are the only faction in the game to have access to both pikes and halberdiers, and this is only the third pike unit in the game overall. Perhaps now the Bridgewater of Nargothrond from Finarfin finally have a rival for the outright best pike in the game, considering the other is a unit of basic human pikes for Fingolfin. But yes, the Lifewood Pikemen of Ered Luin means that the Dwarves have access to not one but two very effective phalanx units, which is a very rare thing in Silmarillion. As I just said, the meta isn't really based around this as much, but if there was going to be a faction that was going to make more use of this kind of thing, where you shore up some very solid front lines, it would be the Naugrim. The Lifewood Pikemen, it's such an effective tool to use as long as your front line remains clear of any outside interference, shall we say, whether that be a flanking move or high damage missiles. Another unit of Iron Arbalists there. Is that 5 units of these crossbows? I mean, he's definitely got a focus in his army here. More Iron Guardsmen as well, so more of these line infantry units. And finally, more Halberdiers as well. You may also notice that these Halberdiers do have a shield as well, so the focus of the Dwarves here very clear. Solid front lines with adequate support around them. They do pay for this in other ways, of course, and we'll see if the attackers can exploit those weaknesses, but otherwise, Iron Halberdiers of Balagost, more Lifeward Hewers. Then over here we start getting into Captain Gervais's army. He has got some more Beast Hunters, as we've already seen. Looks like some Dragon Slayers in there as well. Plenty of polearms, mostly halberds by the looks of things, although looks like there is one unit of the Lifeward Pikemen as well. I'm trying to see if there's any of the other units that I have seen the Dwarves use in the other replay I've already cast so far. Lifeward Hewers, plenty of these heavy axemen, more of the basic infantry as well. I'm pretty convinced we're going to see at least one unit of the really high-end bodyguard infantry, although maybe not, perhaps not. Iron Guardsmen are here, there are Halberdiers, we have more Iron Arbalists and more Beast Hunters, so no, we're not going to see the High Thanes in this replay by the looks of things, which is a bit of a shame, considering how ostentatious they are and how they are ultimately going to be... Actually no, I think the High Thanes are in here, are they not? Yes, you can see them clearly. High Thanes there with their brass helms and yeah, very ornate of course. Definitely throwing their hat into the ring for one of the strongest units of line infantry that this mod has to offer. Now, what will the Naugrim on their debut on this channel be faced with? First of all, Finarfin. So Finarfin will have an opportunity here under the command of Lord of Balagost to try and assert their previous dominance, really, as a frontline combating faction. Swordsmen of Talathin, it should be pretty good. I mean, the Javelins are going to struggle to deal a lot of damage against the more heavily armoured elements of the Dwarven front line, but they will be able to whittle the Dwarves down a little bit, especially if they can get after those pole arms. And then as decent medium infantry as well, they will be able to contribute to matters later on. Defenders of Talathin are much the same, although as spears with the Spear Malice, I'm not sure how much damage they're really going to be able to do as long as the Dwarven lines stay organised. Marksmen of Nargothrond, this is one area, of course, where the Dwarves will fall down. They don't really have access to long-range skirmishes like this, so it may be that you get forced into a situation where you need to move towards the enemy more than you would like. And given the Dwarves' overall speed, that may not be to your liking. Having said that, once you do get into melee, generally speaking, your opponent is going to wish you hadn't made it into melee, so that is the trade-off there. Marksmen of Nargothrond, though, with their split shots again, will be hoping they can get after those Dwarven polearms. I mean, Finarfin, their path of advancement here is going to be fairly tricky. They can put their archers up high, perhaps, to offer some kind of fire support, but the Dwarves are far enough away to the point where I don't think that's going to be terribly relevant, to be honest. Over here, the rest of the Finarfin army is not going to be taking the direct route, instead going to be taking the long way round. More Marksmen of Nargothrond and more Talath-Dyrnin units. And back over here, the Company of Prince Gwyndor, their sort of unique thing, their charge distance isn't going to be terribly relevant in a battle like this, but still, it's neat, and they are ultimately slightly stronger melee combatants than the Swordsmen of Talath-Dyrnin, albeit without that javelin. Arqueni Morma Gilwa, this is the sort of unit which of course will be able to go toe-to-toe with the finest that the Dwarves have to offer. They are very limited in number, of course. Wands of Nargothrond are a must-bring, really, because the armour piercing on these spears is going to be very, very useful in dealing with various aspects of the Dwarven infantry force, and some Swordsmen of Talath-Dyrnin as well. Now then, the middle of the armies, as we've already slightly seen, are the Grey Elves of Mithrim. So their thing, they're not going to be as tanky, perhaps, as Finarfin, less able to engage the Dwarves straight up like their Elven allies, but of course Mithrim do have access to some really nasty long-range archers, which should exploit the Dwarves' most obvious weakness. Sentries of Mithrim, basic spears, I mean, again, defensively they may be able to stand up to the Dwarves for a little while, but they're not going to be able to deal much damage in return, and ultimately some of the better Dwarven infantry will chew through them pretty quickly. Elders of the Twilight Hearth are exactly the kind of unit that the Dwarves are going to worry about. They're going to be able to do quite a lot of damage, plenty of range, as with a fair amount of the Mithrim archers. They do have really nice range on their archers. A little bit back over here as well, we've got some Tunnel Runners. Good damaging unit, but somewhat fragile perhaps. But then again, most of the Dwarven projectiles, it doesn't really matter if you're lightly armoured or heavily armoured when it comes to crossbowmen. They're going to do damage fairly equally to all comers. The Tunnel Runners may want to steer clear of the axe throwers, but apart from that, they've got nothing more to fear than the rest of the army, really. Some Sword Bearers, they'll be a little bit better at dealing damage than the Spear equivalent, that we've already seen, of course, but still, against the upper tier Dwarven units, they will struggle a little bit. But the Hewing Guildsmen of Androth will be a better match for the Dwarves with the extra damage they're going to be able to deal through the Dwarven defences. We've seen the Hewing Guildsmen be very effective for the Mithrim faction reveals that we showed in the last run of Silmarillion replays. Hunters of Mithrim, more javelins, again a very useful tool against factions that like to dig in, like the Naugrim. More Elders of the Twilight Hearth, a second unit, and that's an expensive thing, but considering that archers are the thing that you can bring to bear against Mithrim, as Mithrim against the Naugrim, I should say, it's not too surprising. Lookouts of Mithrim have got a little buckler, but again, return fire is less likely when you're talking about the Naugrim. It's really whether or not all of these archers can actually do enough damage through the Dwarven defences to actually make this worth it, because of course if they don't, they'll just then be cannon fodder in melee, not very effective cannon fodder either. The Elders might be, but basic archers won't. Tunnel Runners, more of them, more Sword Bearers, so a fairly well balanced army this really. Basic javelins, basic archers, plenty of the mainline Mithrim units, a couple of Hewing Guildsmen as well to give you that damage dealing spike, and then a lot of the budget of course has been allocated to 2 Elders of the Twilight Hearth. And last, but by no means least, we have Angband. So again, Angband perhaps in the same way that Finarfin are straight up with their pole arms and their abilities in melee, Angband previously were perhaps the infantry-focused, armour-focused hybrid faction. Feanor might have something to say about that, but Feanor of course have got more of a cavalry spin. Angband have got their Ironshod Legionnaires, which as far as the mainline unit goes are just fine, but we shall have to wait and see if marching alongside the Elves here is going to be enough to make up for some of their shortcomings in comparison to the Dwarves. The Iron Crown units are really where we'll see a bit of a contest here between the heavily armoured dwarves and the heavily armoured orcs. Spearguard of the Iron Crown won't be the most damaging unit around, but they will be able to withstand a real beating even from the Naugrim. Over here, not too surprising to see Ironshod Ravagers. When you're facing off against the Naugrim, armour piercing is always going to be useful, and they have an armour upgrade of their own, but again, it's really just to keep them alive just that little bit longer, a few more swings to try and cut through a few more dwarves. Of course, they are another faction that does have access to a decent polearm in the Ironshod Halberdiers. Polearm on polearm combat, I imagine the Naugrim are going to win, even if it's against Finarfin, to be honest with you, because of the multifaceted nature of them. So that's not an area where Angband can claim dominance either, but it's still very worth bringing them, because if they can get into a position where they're not going halberd to halberd with the Naugrim, and they're instead facing down regular infantry, this is exactly the sort of thing which can equalise a fight quite nicely, and they are numerous after all, so it really does pay to bring them. Bulldogs are another one of those really dangerous units that Angband can bring, and they are something which can genuinely go toe-to-toe with the finest that the Naugrim have to offer. It'd be interesting to see a duel between these and the High Thanes, would it not? Then over here we've got some Ironshod Arbalists back here, so again, crossbow on crossbow action. In fact, Angband overall may be the faction that has most in common mechanically with the Naugrim, interestingly enough. They may not have the numbers to swamp forward like Angband do, but they're a little bit more defensively orientated, but in terms of the way they achieve these things, very similar. Tormentors of the Iron Crown, armour-piercing infantry again, a must-bring, especially given that they can actually keep themselves alive, unlike Ravagers that are in front of them. Another unit of them back there, and more crossbows as well. So no monsters, but that's not too surprising when you send even the Valor Alcar, if you send them into a well-prepared Dwarven front line. With the right kinds of units, they'll be burnt down pretty quickly, especially with stuff like Dragon Slayers around anyway. So, I'll make a little bit of a cut, because I would imagine that there's going to be a little bit of a lull. I mean, the Mithrim could try and shoot into Tundra's Fox, but he's very close to getting behind cover, so I'd imagine it's going to be a little bit of a while before the red team are ready to mount a genuine assault on the dug-in position that we see here. So I'll make a cut, and we'll rejoin when the battle is getting underway. So interesting to note a throwing projectile from the miners of Nogrod here, which does appear to be Nafatoon-esque in its deployment, but doesn't seem to be too devastating considering the general look and feel of it. But yeah, this is going to be a little bit of a problem for Mithrim if they continue to hover in range here as we rejoin the battle now, with Wally Wolf moving a little bit further forward than his allies, which is dangerous. You know, the Grey Elves of Mithrim have certainly got their abilities in melee, but in terms of outright survivability, you wouldn't really want to be taking too much more in the way of punishment than that. The Miners of Nogrod would be another throwing projectile that the Naugrim have at their disposal, in addition to the axe throwers, and then of course there's also the crossbows as well, so plenty of close range punch by the looks of things, which is going to be answered in turn by the javelins of House Finarfin. Albeit these standard swordsmen are non-armour piercing javelins, so they will need to wait until the dwarves have either turned their back or target down a non-shielded unit such as these Beast Hunters of Nogrod here if they want to get their full effectiveness deployed. But easier said than done. I am glad that the dwarves are electing to defend South area, because if they did fall back to the bridge right away, this would have been a terribly dull affair, so I'm glad that that does not appear to be the case. Of course, the good thing here about the Swordsmen of Talath-Dianan is the fact that they are a little bit more durable than the Mithrim units that preceded them, and even though they are a ranged unit, they are more than capable of defending themselves in melee, so it may take more than just a singular unit of basic dwarves here to finish them off appropriately. Angband, meanwhile, are continuing their advance along this side. Now, terrain-wise, the Naugrim certainly have got a bit of an edge over here, but Angband, interesting to see how they do up against the Naugrim, actually, considering the relatively similar strengths that they both share. Albeit Angband a little bit more suited to being on the attack perhaps with their numbers. Axe throwers getting into position. What are they firing at? Well, going after the Swordsmen of Talath-Dianan, but again, Swordsmen of Talath-Dianan are a shielded unit, so provided they're pointing the right way as the volleys come for them, they shouldn't take too much in the way of a beating. Sentries of Mithrim still here. Defenders of Talath-Dianan throwing their javelins down onto the low ground here. This is the slightly bizarre thing about the setup in the defence of this map, is the fact that the dwarves themselves may end up on the receiving end of being hit from the high ground by the attackers, as the elves of Mithrim continue to ready their inevitable assault as the dwarves back themselves up against the wall to make sure that more of those javelins do not hit their marks. Meanwhile, axe throwers getting into position. They'll be the sort of thing which should be pretty good against the standard Mithrim infantry. We'll find out right now. A few throwing axes do come forth. Throwing axes, of course, have got a bit of extra mass to them as well in comparison to javelins, so you will notice a few units fall over. Maybe going flying is a little bit comical, but Medieval 2 is what it is ultimately. Sword bearers may be looking to force a melee engagement here, perhaps the first one of this battle, but with the damage they've already taken and with the beast hunters right here, I'm not sure whether they will be able to come out on top in this fight. Beast hunters are a little bit lower on manpower than the unit they're trying to face down, however, so that might be the saving grace here, especially with some stalkers of Tauren far off on the way forward as well from House Finarfin. The elves should be making some pretty decent gains here against these basic dwarves. That will be that. Sultan Tarthin and threatening perhaps to do the same over here. There are axe throwers on the front line after all, which are already a little bit depleted. And the axe throwers will not be as savvy in melee as the elven swordsmen as they move forward. Once again, there is another unit of beast hunters over here, a full unit this time, that hasn't been subject to as much of a beating from enemy javelins before an engagement. But even so, I would still back the elven infantry here without a little bit of support from the dwarves here. I mean, these basic dwarves are all well and good, but some of the dwarven quality is going to need to be utilised sooner rather than later. Beast hunters closing into melee against the Iron-Shod legionaries. Armour upgrade will help defend them from the dual-wielding dwarves they're facing down. Beast hunters indeed will maybe start to lose ground if Angband want to come in with a lot more power, and the Iron-Shod halberdiers will definitely allow them to do that. Relatively even fight, I would imagine this to be. Beast hunters will not be the best at cracking through that Angband armour. However, they are also going to be... the opposite is also true. Iron-Shod legionaries are not going to be able to do very much damage to the beast hunters themselves, but with the Iron-Shod halberdiers coming forward, it's not too surprising to see the dwarves try and target them down with axe throwers, because phalanx superiority is definitely something which the Naugrim are going to want to claim for themselves here, and that will be far easier to do if the enemy have to expend theirs earlier in the fight. Beast hunters holding on to their line here pretty well, but more javelin support coming in, and those javelins should be pretty good against this unit of beast hunters here. Meanwhile, Hunters of Mithrim trying to move forward to skirmish with the enemy. Doesn't seem to have gone very well though. There's not many of these Hunters of Mithrim that remain. Javelins are all well and good, but Iron Arbalists are here. Not too many of them have fallen as a result of the javelin pressure they've been under. Have the dwarves committed more units forward? No, the axe throwers have managed to escape. This singular unit of beast hunters have actually stood up rather well in melee in terms of keeping themselves alive. They may not have done as much damage as you would like, but dual wielding units do tend to be more of that unit to hold things down in melee with their high melee defense values. Axe throwers have been exposed a little bit here by a unit of stalkers that have pushed through the line, and they may wish to try and retreat some of these axe throwers if they want them to continue. Iron Guildsmen, I mean, we've yet to really see the heart and soul of these dwarven front lines yet. It's more been the rank and file of their armies so far that have been committed. Iron Arbalists look to be out of ammunition, actually. I can't imagine they would have been committed forward into melee by Farkin like this if that wasn't the case, and they are a little bit further away from their defensive line, so maybe Mithrim can set about the business of overwhelming them through sheer numbers. Javelins also forthcoming from the very depleted unit of hunters just in behind them. Are Angband making any progress? I mean, they are, but this was more of a sacrificial lamb type situation from the beast hunters, and the less of the beast hunters remain standing, the easier shots the axe throwers are going to have to hit all of these iron shots as they try to make more progress. Still the dwarves making liberal use of their Nogrod units, but not much else for the time being. So it's perhaps not too surprising they haven't been extremely dominant on the front lines as of yet. Meanwhile, this is the problem with this map. You can see that a very exploitable position here now being utilised by Mithrim. The lookouts are here, and they're going to be able to shoot down into this position. What are they going after? Going after the miners with their throwing projectiles, and not too surprising, but I mean, there are Dragon Slayers there. Iron Arbalists are in a good position. The Life Ward Hewers are a little bit further away. Miners are also in a pretty good position as well, though, so both attackers and defenders have got really good opportunities here for using their skirmishes, but the dwarves seem to be a little bit slower at doing so. You could view this as intelligent caution, or you could view it as dithering. The difference really is measured only by success. Or throwing axes being utilised on the Ironshod Legionaries. Is this a worthwhile use of throwing axes? I don't know. Perhaps they intend to use them before they lose them. I mean, they're trapped up here, this little section of the army, with Mithrim having claimed this ground down here. This little section of the Dwarven army cannot retreat back to the bridge any longer, so they're going to have to fight and die. Iron Arbalists being overwhelmed by the Mithrim units, as perhaps was feared. But now we're going to see the Dwarven Phalanx in action, and this will be an interesting one. So we've got the Iron Halberdiers over here, the Lifeward Pikemen are coming forward, and that is more out of necessity than anything else, I think, because you can see there are bridge wards of Nargothrond supporting the advance of the regular Mithrim infantry, and the Naugrim may need their own pikes here if they are to be successful on the front line, because over time you would imagine the superior range on the bridge wards would allow them to bully the Dwarven Halberdiers, especially with the slight shifting going on in the lines at the moment. And there is the split shot projectiles coming forth from the marksmen from Nargothrond. Iron Arbalists being bullied so far. The Dwarven players need to get their ducks in a row a little bit more quickly than they're managing to do here. It's some very messy defence from them so far. And as much as when you're a faction like this you can afford the odd misstep because you're pretty much built for this kind of battle, you can't afford to display too much in the way of incompetence. Sword Bearers of Mithrim continuing to push forwards, and they will be able to overwhelm these Nogrod units, as has been the way in this battle so far. There are more units yet to be deployed, and indeed they will need to be deployed at some point, because, like I said, there is no retreat from this position. Lookouts of Mithrim are now leaving the area, perhaps repositioning for a better shot. Still some more Beast Hunters over here. Both the Nogrod units and the Ironshods from Angband have both taken a real beating in this melee engagement over here, but now the Ironshods using their own crossbows. We've already seen in the background the Iron Arbalists going about their business. And they continue to fire, albeit they have turned around at this point and are trying to fire on the advance of Mithrim and Finarfin down on the low ground rather than trying to stymie the Angband advance. Still plenty of Angband units ready to be utilised. Miners of Nogrod still in the background. Still this unit up here as well, perhaps waiting for the opportune moment to really let loose with their projectiles, but they can't afford to wait too long here because I can't help but notice they really don't have a huge amount of infantry up here when you take into account that a lot of it is ranged units. They've got a few Dragon Hunters, a few more Beast Hunters, those are Axe Throwers. More of these miners now trying to do yet more damage to the Mithrim units, as more of the Nogrod units are more here to just stand in the way, and then in the background you can also see the split shot projectiles trying to do the business against the Dwarven units waiting in the backfield. Not so sure about this advance. Mithrim and Finarfin coming forward again with the combination of standard Mithrim infantry anchored in place by the Finarfin pikes. The Finarfin pikes will do fine as long as they can maintain their formation, but this is actually going to be an interesting little duel here because they are going up against the Lifeward pikemen, so a pike-to-pike fight is rare in Silmarillion. It always has been, with previously only 2 units, this one only being the 3rd to have been added. And there we go. Iron Guardsmen, plenty of them ready to join the fight. I mean, you can see here that they are taking a lot of damage as a result of the axe throws from on high, contributing to the Dwarven frontline's efforts, and that's going to be really bad news for the pikes, and indeed the bridge wards getting ripped apart by a combination of going up against a foe which is their equal in melee and also taking throwing axes. Not a great situation for them there, but over here things are a little bit different. You can see that the dwarves are trying to close the gap and engage them in close quarters with stuff like the Lifeward Hewers. But it's going slightly better for them over here, the dwarves front line looking a little bit less assured, but there are also these Iron Arbalists providing very close range support. Tunnel runners also there. And there are still more Mithrim reinforcements to be deployed, plenty of them. And Finarfin infantry as well. Finarfin actually moving forward now with some Wardens of Nargothrond, as well as some marksmen, as the Hunters of Mithrim end up routing along with the sentries. That's not too surprising though, this fight was going pretty badly for the attackers, and that's exactly the sort of thing which the defenders needed to see based on how the initial engagements on the battlefield were going. Sword bearers of Mithrim making slow but steady progress against the remaining Naugrim units which are blocking their advance up here, and assisting Angband's advance will help the attackers in the long run. It will allow them to deal more efficiently with these forces over here. Meanwhile, Dragon Slayers now getting up into close melee. Axe and shield infantry, but this maybe isn't the greatest fight for them in terms of melee alone, but with the support of those miners, I don't think these iron-shod halberdiers are going to hold up too much longer. They'll continue to take a pretty decent beating here as the iron-shod arbalists in behind doing their best to lay down some covering fire. I do wonder what they're shooting at, because it's exactly the kind of tool which can be very effective against a faction like the dwarves, going after the miners that are right in front of them, trying to limit the use of these throwing projectiles that the dwarves have employed so far. One of the more effective aspects of their army up till this point. Looks like the miners now out of ammunition, so they're going to move forward and interrupt the iron-shod arbalists from continuing to fire, but with the advancing spear guard of the Iron Crown, I don't think that the miners are going to stick around, and indeed they don't. Going to try and surround the iron-shod legion and halberdiers that remain, perhaps in an attempt to rout them, which may very well be successful. Can barely see the iron-shods anymore through the smoke. Any more being added over here? Another unit of beast hunters shoring up the front line to coincide with the arrival of some more Finarfin units. Another unit of swordsmen of Talafdirnin. And the Naugrim continue to hold their ground over here. Swordsmen getting in position to try and support another advance. You can see the marksmen out of ammunition going up against the life ward hewers, but this is a fight in which the dedicated infantry should, and indeed does, have the edge. Life ward pikemen are here. Another unit of Nargothrond units now with the wardens. I mean, the armour piercing on those elven spears should be useful against the dwarves, but this dwarven phalanx is still going to hold up just fine for the time being. Swordsmen of Talafdirnin trying to push through the side of this line over here, introduce a bit of chaos, but even if they're successful, because of the reserves they have, the Iron Guardsmen would simply be deployed, and that would surely be enough to turn back a single unit of Swordsmen of Talafdirnin, making a very aggressive and costly push through a dwarven formation. And while on the low ground, which was the first theatre of war to be opened, more stalkers are arriving. I mean, some ground has been made by the elves, but the dwarves are still fighting hard down here. Iron arbalists out of ammunition being added to the front line. More reluctant perhaps to commit their units over here as a result of the elves' ability to get their supporting units into position and start shooting at them. Elders of the Twilight Hearth are doing just that, I believe. What are they going after though? Probably a phalanx unit, and indeed I think it is a unit of Iron Halberdiers. They're going to try and get into a defence position. There's more life ward hewers. Dragon Slayers. You can of course see the High Thanes waiting for their opportunity. The Iron Guardsmen have already been deployed as a preemptive measure, and indeed the Swordsmen of Talafdirnin getting turned back. I mean, the elves, other than on the low ground, they are in a little bit of danger here of having their attacks start to waver, so they need to get ready to send their reinforcements in, which are a little bit further away than maybe would be ideal. Sword bearers starting to look like routing as well. The Naugrim units starting to showcase their abilities despite some earlier struggles. Tormentors of the Iron Crown moving forward. The Angband Maceman will be a welcome addition for the attackers on these frontline fights. Busting through those dwarven armour values. Tormentors, more of them. Iron-shod arbalists. The Bulldogs are pretty close as well, with Spear Guard as well. I mean, Spear Guard are going to be significantly less damaging against dwarven infantry, but they themselves are obviously very durable as well. Outside of the armour piercing options the Naugrim have, not going to be the easiest foes to dislodge. Iron-shod arbalists are there. Miners continuing to fight in melee. Axe throwers maybe trying. I mean, the problem over here is a lot of the units that are left are now not miners, but the miners are included in the Naugrim class of units. And I think if Angband are going to commit to committing more Iron Crown units into the fight, Angband should have the momentum to clear this part of the battlefield, and then I think that will necessitate a dwarven retreat to the bridges, to be honest. If they stay where they are, they'll be able to get shot by the Angband crossbows. Going to form up a little bit of a last stand up here on the hill though. And some not insignificant units up here either. Plenty of Life Ward Hewers, which are going to be pretty devastating against the Angband army as they continue to send forward some Ironshod Ravagers to consolidate their gains. But yes, the dwarves are now starting to retreat into more appropriate positions for the situation. Backs to the wall against Angband now. They are still doing okay here on this front line with these Naugrim units, but all it takes really is for one Angband infantry unit to make its way down here, and all of that work will be undone. So watch this space. Meanwhile, Elves of the Twilight Hearth looking to be leading another clutch of Mithrim units. Warns of Nargothrond are getting overwhelmed here by the dwarves. Again, this has been the attacking lane which has gone the worst, I would say, for the attackers so far. Sending another unit of spears in, more Mithrim infantry in general, just to try and do the business against the dwarves. But I don't think Mithrim, outside of their hewing guildsmen, have really got the damage necessary to bust through those dwarven defences. And actually, you can see here, the High Thanes have been committed forward, as well as more Dragon Slayers, which is bad news for the elves down here. I mean, the company of Prince Gwindor moving forward, but they're going to struggle against a unit as scary as the High Thanes of Ered Luin. Elsewhere on this front line it's a little bit messy perhaps, but the dwarves still clinging on. Hewing Guildsmen are over here though. This is one of the units, like I said, that the Naugrim will be afraid of because of their very nasty attack power. Stalkers are also further forward. Do the dwarves have what it takes to continue to commit units over here? I'm not sure. You can see the beginnings of a retreat happening now, I think, as a result of Angband's gains as well. Can they afford to uncouple themselves from this front line over here though now? They may well continue to hold on, but the unit of Life Ward Hewers over here, perhaps to try and facilitate the end of this fight just a little more quickly. First example of something good happening for the attackers on this front line as well, with these tunnel runners of Mithrim able to sneak their way around the front line. Angband continue to move forward. Have they committed any units over here to deal with the Naugrim units? I think perhaps they did, because there's not many of them left, and much of them are routing. Still a lot of Angband units way out there in the open field. Ironshod Arbalists may be thinking about trying to skirmish down the initial dwarven defences, but the Iron Arbalists are alone. That's a lot of Life Ward Hewers. I mean, that's what, 5 units of them? It may only be 53 per unit, but they're exactly the sort of thing which is going to be very scary for the armour-clad Angband combatants. Down over here, Iron Halberdiers are still there. Elven firing squads starting to set themselves up. Lookouts of Mithrim and Marksmen of Nargothrond getting into place, and they are trying to shoot at the dwarves as they start crossing the bridges. It's in these transitional phases so far which you'd have to say the dwarves have been punished pretty roundly by the attackers for this. I mean, you can see the losses that they're taking here as a result of the elven firepower. They can't afford too much more of that, to be honest. Iron Guardsmen are here. High Thanes haven't taken that many losses. Hewing Guildsmen very likely to find themselves outmatched by the kind of foes that they're trying to tussle with here. A little bit further up here, the dwarves can't really leave this area yet. The Life Ward Hewers doing their thing, doing their bit for the front line. Iron Halberdiers starting to run a little bit low. Life Ward Hewers having to re-divert their attention because of the annoyance that the tunnel runners have become. What will the dwarves do though? Meanwhile, Angband are now beginning their main assault. I thought they were going to try and skirmish, but I guess they're just going to go all in. Some axe throwers here offering a little bit of support. They'll be trying to do their bit against the less protected units like the Ironshod Ravagers, but for the rest the dwarves will be dependent on the heavy axeman to show Angband the error of their ways in attacking this place. There's a lot of Life Ward hewers, like I said, and so far Angband don't seem to be holding up too well under this kind of scrutiny. It's a difficult kind of formation to break through, however. A little bit further back. Reinforcements are a little bit further away as well. I mean, Tormentors of the Iron Crown are all well and good against the Naugrim, but in this kind of situation, the kind of units you're against, the terrain, enemy range support, it's a grisly situation for these orcs. And so far it's been pretty painful for them. Meanwhile, down over here, more marksmen of Nargothrond out of ammunition, heading into the fray. Elves of the Twilight Hearth have been the anchor to this line for a little while at this point. Tunnel runners just overwhelming with sheer numbers against the few remaining Life Ward hewers. Have they managed to retreat anything else? I mean, the High Thanes have been left behind as a rear guard, which is an interesting choice to say the least. I don't think they're going to be able to fight their way out of this one. Hewing Guildsmen, Company of Prince Gwyndor, a few Dragon Slayers in amongst here as well, but they too are pretty depleted. I'm sure that the High Thanes could escape if they wanted to. They'll take a few losses as they do so, but I think they really do need to get out of here, to be honest. They're the kind of unit which would come in very useful later, but I don't know how many losses they're going to take in retreating now. The bridge, of course, very much in range of those elven skirmishers. Well, Ironshod Ravagers and Halberds trying to make their presence felt on the front line, but struggling to do so. And so far the Life Ward hewers not ceding any more ground to Angband. Ironshod Arbalists. Some tunnel runners back there. Still, those Angband units are pretty far away. Let's not, of course, forget the hidden units that Tundra's Fox has got over here. A couple of units of Beast Hunters. Beast Hunters seem to be relatively basic as far as Naugrim units go, but two units popping up out of nowhere later on in the battle will be a nasty surprise. Plenty of Angband units, like I said, still just biding their time and waiting, and that may not be particularly great. I mean, this assault from Evan has gone pretty poorly and will continue to do so without more reinforcements. There's Dwarven Axemen. Now the miners, sorry, not miners, axe throwers who are out of ammunition also joining melee, adding to the duress that these orcs are under. The dwarves continuing to pull back. Is this the end of the High Thanes? Indeed it is. There's only two remaining. Is one the general? I guess this is the general. Yes, it is. Decked out in his pink armour, let's call it what it is. Still some Life Ward piping around. I mean, it's been a bit of a mixed bag for both teams, I think. Both teams have had their good engagements and their bad engagements, but I don't know, we'll see. In a bridge fight, I don't know how many phalanx units the dwarves have left that they've managed to retreat over there, but we shall see. Marksmen in position, tunnel runners there, lookouts of Mithrim, waiting for their opportunity. Ironshod Arbalists now in place. This is the kind of support that Angband sorely need to try and break down the dwarves, to be honest, with how it's gone so far for them on this front line. Just to get a more granular view of this battle as it happens. I mean, Tormentors of the Iron Crown as Macemen are definitely a worthwhile addition against this kind of force, but Spear Guard of the Iron Crown, a lot of their defensive ability comes from their very heavy armour, and of course that's going to be less of a boon against a unit like these hewers. Spear Guard there, but diminishing. Life Ward hewers maybe trying to peel themselves off the front line so they don't become such an obvious target for the Ironshod Arbalists. The rest of the Angband army is now being mobilised, and they will try to wipe away all resistance once and for all. Meanwhile, the elves, not hanging around for Angband support by the looks of things, are moving forwards. Those Iron Legion engineers there, the chariots, you can see their projectiles scything through the elves as they make their way steadily across the bridges. Of course, there are only so many projectiles that thing is capable of firing at any one time, so And many of these units are getting back up, so it looks more devastating perhaps than it is, but it is still a worry for the elves, because this is free damage that the dwarves are essentially able to get done here. The lookouts of Mithrim moving forward in the vanguard, out of ammunition as they are, they're less of a concern. There's also a few remaining hewing guildsmen after their close encounter with the High Thanes. Now the Iron Legion engineers are going to kite backwards and do the business there. Beast Hunters of Naugrim going to block any further advance so that the chariots are fully covered. They do have some halberdiers left. I don't know though, I'm not sure whether this is going to be enough, considering that I believe we have yet to see stuff like the Bulldogs and the Arqueni Morma Gilwan, considering that they can be such an impressive centre to a general assault. Don't know whether they have the quality left, but we'll see. Halberdiers in the late game. I don't think many of the attackers are going to have much in the way of phalanx units left after their exertions elsewhere. We already know the bridge wards are all but gone. Don't think there are going to be many iron-shod halberdiers left either after their brush with the dwarves on the hilltops. Beast Hunters blocking the advance. They're going to get completely overrun here. There goes a Dwarven General. Well, what is occurring over here then? Angband's starting to make gains now through brute strength. More Iron Crown units arriving, but now the dwarves once again setting themselves up. The Arbalists trying to get into a position to shoot from the side, which may be what has caused the slightly odd manoeuvring of the dwarves so far, and indeed that has proven to be the case. But now in melee against Lifeward Hewers, these Arbalists are not going to have a particularly great time. Naturally, Tormentors of the Iron Crown doing their thing, but that's going to be a painful experience. And the two Nogrod units that Tundra's Fox had as an ambush party are now also revealing themselves, but based on the fact that these units have turned around, they have been noticed. And with Halberdiers and Ravagers, I don't think it's going to be as effective maybe as Tundra's Fox was hoping for, but it was a good idea. We'll see, it may still be effective. But Angband can see it. Going on here, Ironshod Arbalists retreating from the fight after the Lifeward Hewers did a lot of damage to them. The Lifeward Hewers need to hold their position, to be honest. If they don't, then you're going to see this, where Angband simply swarm over them. They need to maintain a solid line and hope that their quality is enough to do enough damage that in the end their team can win the battle. They are at least facing off against the faction that they will be best against. Meanwhile, down here on the bridges themselves have actually been largely forsaken in favour of taking up a position over here. Lifeward Pikemen are still alive. That's an important save as well from Ered Luin. 64 of them available. And then you've also got the Iron Guardsmen forming the shield on the front of the front line. Plenty of these Dwarven infantrymen, and I don't know, I mean certainly this initial wave of the assault from these Finarfin elves that are attacking will not be enough to crack through this front line easily. There's plenty more where that came from, and not just from depleted units such as they're sending at the moment. Elsewhere, more Lifeward Hewers. It does look as though the Dwarven resistance over here is going to be broken ultimately, and there are Bulldogs on the front line, so Angband very much hoping to deal with the situation now. Tundra's General is over here, managed to save him, waiting perhaps, and I think they realised perhaps that the Beast Hunters were not going to be too effective going into Angband there. I mean, Angband are going to know at this point that there are units there, but Tundra's Fox doesn't need to send them into a fight that would be suicidal for them, and won't really gain the dwarves all that much if he does so, so he can wait to bide his time. That is the sort of thing to keep an eye on as well. Tundra's General is still there. On the main front line, as it has become at this point, Marksman Nargothrond a little bit surprised to see these Iron Guardsmen moving back off the front line from Farkin, especially considering that his Lifeward Pikemen are here. You definitely need some support. I mean, the Lifeward Pikes Perhaps he wants them doing the heavy lifting in melee, slowly prodding the enemy to death. Some of the more heavily armoured Nargothrond units will probably take a while to go down, considering the relatively low rate of damage most pikes tend to operate at. Anyway, we shall view the heroic last stand of the Lifewood Hewers on this hill, utterly surrounded by Iron Crown class units, a few Iron Shod halberds as well. And they did pretty well over here. I mean, it wasn't quite as devastating for Angband, I think, as the defenders would have wanted it to be. Initially it looked like it was going to be, but ultimately Angband did the wise thing and doubled down on it and committed to using their overwhelming force, and that has yielded results ultimately. Defeat seems certain. Only a military genius could win this battle. I think it's going to take more than a military genius. I think it's going to take something like divine intervention for the dwarves to turn back Angband at this juncture in the battlefield. That's going to be the end of them. There's a single unit of Beast Hunters which is over here. I think the other one is moving to link up perhaps with the General. No, they've gone past that point, so they're going to try instead and go after some units around here perhaps. And maybe not the Halberds though. Most of the units that still remain this far back in the battlefield are more of Angband's army, as they have just completely cleared out the dwarves. Now then, how is the Dwarven last stand going to go? Lifewood pikemen trying to do the lion's share of the work here on the front line. So far so good for them in that capacity. A further 38 Mithrim sword bearers are on the way forwards to keep this assault going just that little bit longer. The rest of these units as well, Elves of the Twilight Hearth steadily making their way forward. Lookouts of Mithrim, they've still got their bows, so they still have a bit of ammunition. A little bit of pressure that can be put on the dwarves from afar. There's a unit that was hidden just then, but I completely missed what they were. 2 units of Elves of the Twilight Hearth is an interesting choice from Wollywolf. This one still seems to have ammunition, so something else for the Naugrim to be worried about. And then we start to get into the Angband units, so really not an awful lot left from Finarfin. What happened to the Arquani? Are they still around? Beast Hunters waiting for their opportunity? As well as Tundra's General. I mean, that is still something which the attackers will need to deal with, those 2 units of Beast Hunters. Maybe not the scariest unit in the world among the rest of the Dwarven roster, but still 2 completely healthy units of infantry. Now with the support of those close range troops, as well as some ranged hits as well from the engineers. I think this assault is going to fully collapse, which is always a good thing to see as defenders, a terrible thing to see as attackers. I think the attackers have built up enough in the tank here that they can afford one of their assaults to fall apart. Elves of the Twilight Hearth should help keep the fires of this assault lit for just a little bit longer, but I'm not sure even they are going to enjoy being under a certain amount of scrutiny from the Dwarven chariots as they are, one of which is already bloodied. Some halberds, they'll be useful in the late game against Angband, 2 units of them as well. The earlier committal of the Lifewood pikemen to try and deal with the elves. So the dwarves perhaps organising their units in the best possible way. There goes the Finarfin General. I mean, the Arquani must have been committed, I guess, at some point, because I cannot see them. Maybe they were dealt with relatively fast by defending Naugrim crossbows. Iron Guardsmen again leaving the front line. It is a rather strange way of operating this from Farkin. I guess don't take damage if it's not needed, but you're offering up a bit of a gap here for a unit like the Tunnel Runners, who have already shown themselves perfectly capable of exploiting this sort of thing before. And they are getting in behind enemy lines now. I mean, I guess, well, I was going to say it's fortunate they don't really have much to help deal with them. The bane of the incomers, though. They could certainly consolidate their gains here, Mithrim. If Angband are fast enough on the uptake, the back, the Beast Hunters sort of shadowing the Angband advance as they make their way across the map. You don't want to get too close, of course, because Angband could simply turn around and demolish them very quickly, but they want to stay close enough that they can maybe pick off stragglers when the time comes, which of course inevitably it will, as Angband's Ironshot Arbalists are starting to cross the bridges as well, so I guess the Orcs will be the last ones to do their thing. The bane of the incomers with their absolutely wild projectiles. Scatter shots. The arrows in mid-flight will split apart into many smaller arrows, and they're going after the Iron Halberdiers, and they're doing a fair amount of damage to them actually, considering the dwarves are always going to be relatively resilient to this sort of thing. We did see the chariots flirt with the idea of getting in and amongst the action over here, but it's always dangerous to do that with chariots. They can very quickly find themselves falling away, as is the case with most monstrous class cavalry, which chariots basically are in the mechanics of the game. Sword bearers making up the bulk of this attack for now. Bane of the incomers certainly proving to be the bane of the Naugrim for the time being, taking yet more damage that maybe they can ill afford to, the dwarves. A moment further back, there's still some lookouts left alive. Crossbows starting to make their presence felt is the last thing the Naugrim will be looking forward to as well. Still got more crossbows as well. I mean, there's 3 units in total that Angband have, with their crossbows still out, so we've still got some ammunition here. The Iron Halberdiers acting as a rear guard as those 2 units of Beast Hunters continue to just shadow the Angband advance through the already occupied part of the map on the part of the attackers. Some routing Finarfin units. I mean, it does look as though Finarfin are largely a spent force at this point. Bane of the incomers. Continuing to try and shoot. The Iron Halberdiers now joining the front line as well, just in time to meet the advance of this unit of Elders of the Twilight Hearth. Again, Mithrim maybe not the most reliant on their armour, but the phalanx nature of the Iron Halberdiers, decent damage scores as well, still persisting with pulling the Iron Guardsmen and melee infantry off the front lines at any given opportunity. I'm not sure that's wise on the part of Farkin here. I think that these phalanx units need a little bit more cover when they're going up close and personal with all these units. I mean, yes, most of the units they're facing off against are spears, which are not going to be the most damaging units in the world, but I still think a little bit of dwarven infantry, even if it's just 1 unit, would make me feel better about this situation. Meanwhile, Bane of the incomers with their cobalt blue axes also getting involved in melee, having already dealt some pretty stinging blows to the Naugrim defenders. They actually have left in reserve at this point. I mean, they've still got those Iron Guardsmen and Rifled Hewers, the Iron Guardsmen that they keep retreating from the front line. There's some Arbalists, which still actually have some ammunition. They have a good enough shot, I don't know. On the side, I mean, they do have a gap, I suppose, and they are going to make use of that. Elves of the Twilight Hearth are definitely a worthwhile target too. Ironshot Arbalists getting very close, but they don't have the best of shots either at the moment. There's always the chariots as well. What's going on over here then? The Dwarven General linking back up with the Beast Hunters that are here. The other unit starting to take the other route around. Angband, I mean, this does serve a purpose, because Angband do need to keep units behind in order to meet the challenge of these units, which means it's units they cannot commit to the main fight. So Angband will have to pull their punches, at least in some capacity, against those units. I can't help but feel as though just a few volleys from the Ironshot Arbalists would actually fix this problem though, because I don't know how easily you're going to be able to utilise crossbow ammunition against this kind of defence, given the situation is what it is. Not many clear sight lines to make use of here for Angband. Actually, they have 4 units of Ironshot Arbalists. A big investment in their crossbows. They are reloading now. Fire at. They are firing over there, and actually they do have a pretty decent shot into those Iron Halberdiers. It's unfortunate for them. I don't know if I would bother retreating further from Captain Gervais's point of view. There's really not much further you can retreat to. I mean, you can go to the top of the hill, I suppose, but to do so is more or less waving the white flag at this point. I think you need to consolidate your force. That has to be the Finarfin player falling by the wayside. Naugrim doing pretty well on the front line still. Lookouts of Mithrim coming in to support the bane of the incomers, who in melee have not really been up to the task of facing the dwarves. I do think Angband need to get a shimmy on here. They are dawdling on the other side of the river somewhat, almost waiting for their allies to fall. But to do so is folly, I think. Units are on their way now, but taken far too long, I think, for them to make up their mind to do this. I know, of course, that it's a long way for them to transit, but we have seen these units effectively stood around for the past 3,000-ish frames, not doing anything. A little bit concerning. Iron Guildsmen are here, lookouts of Mithrim maybe with some gaps they can exploit, but this is more of an active decision for the dwarves, I think, to actually retreat from this position while they have the opportunity to. But as they do so, they will be under the attentions of annoyances like the lookouts of Mithrim and genuine dangers like iron-shod arbalist volleys. Of course, being on this hill does offer them the ability to mitigate the ability of those crossbows to get into a position that is capable of hitting them at all. The chariots now being deployed as they slowly but surely mulch their way through the lookouts of Mithrim, the chariots getting caked in blood as they do so, though. The lookouts of Mithrim don't look like routing at the moment. I mean, chariots are going to be difficult to use in this kind of chaotic situation with so many units in the way for them to bump into. Momentum is kind of everything with a unit such as this. Lookouts of Mithrim trying to kill off a few Naugrim on the way past as they retreat. Are we going to see a bit of an assault? Nope. The Beast Hunters, as Angband move forward, they do edge forward themselves. I don't know what sort of danger they represent, but like I said, Angband have to leave at least a couple of units behind to be sure of dealing with that kind of thing. And are those couple of units going to be necessary for dealing with the dwarves in their final defensive position around this spire here? We'll actually go up to time 6 speed for this bit, because it's probably going to be a case of waiting for Angband to actually get themselves across the bridges so that the final fight can begin. There's a few dwarves left, but the rest of their units have already made their way forward. Iron Halberdiers moving down, but this is a completely sort of unimportant engagement, really. Halberdiers might even be enough to defeat those lookouts of Mithrim. Arbalists could shoot them, I suppose, but there you go. Angband slowly but surely. I guess Angband aren't really what you think of when you think of a swift faction, so they're plodding their way into position, waiting for the time to strike. I mean, it's going to take them a little while to get to the top of the hill as well, let alone across the bridges. Last time we saw this map, we have seen this map once before, of course. The final stand did take place down here. The top of the hill was not utilised, but this time the dwarves are electing to use it. I think that is more as a result, really, of those arbalists and trying to make their life as difficult as possible. Iron-shod arbalists are kind of exposed, actually, but the Iron Legion engineers not going to move forwards, because if they do so they'll get shot on the approach, and that may be enough to finish them off. And even if it's not, infantry close behind, bulldogs are there, 18 of them. Looking down across the bridges, the dwarves will see that some of their kin are on the way. I mean, this is a fairly, maybe a little bit overkill from the dwarves here to leave the, or not the dwarves, the orcs to leave this many units behind to answer the challenge of the Beast Hunters. What's going on there? we've got the general for Tundra's Fox going up against the general of the elves. I mean, it was 2 versus 2, but the elven general second decided to kamikaze in before ever really being given the chance. So who's your money on here? I mean, the elven general is an elder of the Twilight Hearth, and technically the dwarven general is a miner of Naugrim. So, in terms of the individual stats, perhaps it's for the best that it's a 2v1 on this occasion. This is probably more interesting maybe than the actual final battle would be, just because it's very rare that you see 2 generals go toe-to-toe like this. The elven general seems unable to actually defeat the second of the dwarven one. The elven general seems to be able to land his hits, however, whereas the miner of Nogrod here doesn't really seem to be able to do so. Every blow is being parried so far. There's no impact hit. And this, I guess, is to be expected from a sword-wielding elf against the most basic of dwarves. I'm actually surprised that this miner has survived this long, actually. Now, based on the fact that you saw him there very briefly grow to regular size, which is why I thought the kill animation was actually going to start. Because that is something that happens to the dwarves if you look very closely in the various Medieval 2 mods. Saw it very briefly there. The elf doesn't seem to really be interested in killing this dwarf though, more tormenting him. Actually, that was the first time that the Miner of Nogrod has actually landed a hit. And we shall return to this action shortly, because I believe, yes indeed, the final fight is underway. I don't know if the Naugrim are going to have enough here. I mean, Angband have got a lot left in reserve. Many of their units have actually made their way up here now, which is part of the reason why I think the Beast Hunters, you can still see that fight between the Miner and the Elven General continues to go on. Ironshot Arbalists trying to do their thing, and they are actually succeeding in doing their thing as well. Clear sight lines, which is a bit of a concern. I mean, in terms of phalanx units and quality, the Dwarves do have the edge, but Angband do have those numbers, and that is going to be difficult to reconcile with, I think. Now then, back to the real deciding factor. This miner continues to have not fallen. I suppose technically as an Elder of the Twilight Hearth, this general technically counts as a spearman, so he has a spear malice, even though he himself is wielding a sword. He takes the stats from his unit as a whole, so it's a bit of a wet noodle fight ultimately. A low tier line infantry slash skirmisher unit up against a higher tier spear slash archer unit. So perhaps this was always going to be somewhat inevitable. Actually landed another hit as well, the miner there. He's done very well for himself. I guess out of a sense of fairness, the Dwarven General is allowing the elf the chance to kill his squire? Question mark? I guess. A quick look in to the fight, which ultimately will determine the outcome of the battle as a whole. Ironshot Arbalists continuing to do their thing. There are still Lifeward Pikemen over here. And so far, Angband continuing to take losses. They need to maybe get some reinforcements up here to truly overwhelm. I mean, the Bulldogs are in behind enemy lines. Probably a bad sign, all things considered. And the Beast Hunters here are running out of time, really, to try and do something useful. I mean, they may have to just try and throw themselves in and hope for the best, if that hilltop position looks like it is going to fall. Oh, the Dwarven General has lost patience with this. The elf has taken too long to kill off his second. And now they shall fight against one another. A duel for the ages. Duels are not the sort of thing that you see that often in Medieval 2, for obvious reasons. And yet here we go. The Dwarven General also intermittently growing to full size. It's I'm alive. It's the sort of thing which is quite off-putting when you see it in this sort of capacity, isn't it? You're not surrounded. But it is amazing that you don't really notice that en masse when the dwarves are actually fighting, isn't it? I guess because there's so much going on. Oh, and there we go. The elf is victorious. Can he be victorious overall, however? Can he finish off this simple miner as well? Exactly the sort of phrase you'd expect to hear an elf utter. They are still fighting one another apparently, but they seem reluctant to do so. Maybe a sense of mutual respect has been formed. Anyway, yeah, it's not looking great for the dwarves here. They're getting themselves surrounded. Crossbow bolts are raining down on them. Armor-piercing damage is coming at them from different angles. Yeah, ripping through them there. Are they going to move forward with these units? Tundra's Fox, I think he's already run out of time, to be honest. He hasn't really had a great opportunity to utilise them. So it's not really his fault, but I think he just needs to throw them in at this point. Let his units die with a little bit of honour. The chariots, of course, when you back them into a corner like this, chariots are always going to end up having one fate and one fate only. And you can see their corpses strewn about the active battlefield. Arbalists trying to move into a better position. Is that another Dwarven general? It's kind of hard to tell. We saw an Orc fall, but it wasn't the Orc general. At least I don't think it was. Kind of difficult to tell in a chaotic situation like this. Ah, here we go. Better late than never, I suppose. The Beast Hunters do charge in. I think they'll struggle to make an impression against the armour of the Iron Crown units and the supporting phalanx of the Iron Shod Halberdiers. Well, I guess we'll see. Still not too interested in fighting one another, are they? Oh no, I take it back. The elf is trying to... and laughing at the dwarf as well. I take back my claims about maybe mutual respect has been kindled. Turns out no. The elf literally standing on the corpse of the fallen dwarven general. Maybe not quite the debut that the dwarves wanted. But ultimately I think that they are paying the price really for hovering around in full view of the elves. If they wanted to contest these areas over here, they needed to be more aggressive, more on the front foot, and not allow the elves to get themselves into such devastating archer positions earlier on. But they didn't. And ultimately that has proven to be their undoing on this occasion. In terms of pure melee, however, they've performed very well, as you would perhaps expect from this kind of faction. Still both alive down there. Have they died off that quickly? Yeah, I guess they have. I mean, I guess they're trying to push through the lines, which is why these Beast Hunters are dying. Actually, no, that's also going to be why they're dying off so quickly. They're getting hit at near point-blank range by crossbows. That would explain quite a lot, wouldn't it? Further back, this dwarf finds his courage once again. I'm surprised he's been able to hit the elf as much as he has, to be honest, but I'd be extremely surprised if he won this duel. Surely is going to be the end of this particular last stand. Yeah, Iron Shod Halberdiers, broken. Not Iron Shod, Iron Halberdiers. Confusing. But yes, the dwarves. Resistance finally broken. Angband. Most of what they have left, actually, they've still got 3 units of Iron Shod Arbalists, which make up the vast majority of their numbers, to be fair. So it wouldn't have taken much more, I don't think, for the dwarves to actually reverse this fight. A few more of those volleys not being taken as they cross the bridge. Maybe the High Thanes not being largely wasted, I think, would have made a bit of a difference. Obviously the devil is in the details in this kind of fight. There's probably several things I missed that each individual player could tell me about post-battle, but it is what it is. Final Dwarven General, I believe that will be. falls away, and the Beast Hunters are gone. And that leaves the final battle. Again, this duel, which actually the duel between the elf and this one miner has been probably more impactful than the actual battle between the two generals. I really can't imagine that this dwarf has got much life left in him though. He has been able to land hits, but he's actually getting more reliable hits landing as well. The elf taking a swing at one of the fleeing dwarves. But I feel as though this one is going to fight to the bitter end. Let's go up to ×2 speed. Another hit landed. Are any of these going to stick though? It's only a matter of time before one of these two lands the telling strike. You can see all of the Angband units are actually, I think, just going to wait and see what the result of this glorious battle is going to be. I think the Elven General would certainly have earned his trip back to Mithrim if he manages to be victorious here. Where's he going? Where are you going, miner? I was going to say I thought he was going to try and kamikaze charge into Angband then he would still have the opportunity to kill this Elven General. Caked in blood as both of them are. I think, well, one of the next 1 or 2 hits is going to be the ending. There we go. The elf ultimately victorious, as perhaps you would expect, but a very fine performance from that one miner. Better actually than the general he was accompanying. And there we have it. The Naugrim's debut in Silmarillion. A rather topsy-turvy kind of battle, to be honest with you, which ultimately the Naugrim have ended up losing. But it was a difficult fight for them. I mean, this map, especially if you don't want it to be really boring and fall back to the bridges immediately, the terrain is difficult to defend. And like I said, the Naugrim kind of went about their business in the wrong way if they wanted to mitigate the effects of this tiered system, which the attackers can use to their advantage as much as the defenders can. So yeah, that would be the thing I would do differently. If you're going to try and defend out here, you need to be a little bit more aggressive, push your front lines a little bit further forwards, rather than having one eye on retreating so soon into the battle and as a result deploying too far back and allowing the elves all of the room they need to use their archers, and that ultimately ended up being a blow from which it turned out the Naugrim would never recover from. But still, some interesting things. A general duel, lots of dwarven units that we got to see. Like I said, there will be 2 more replays that involve the Naugrim, both of which were pointed out by Lord of Balagost, but they're going to be from the perspective of various different people. This one from Tundra's Fox, I believe the next one may have been Captain Gervais actually, that we'll see from, and then the final one in another battle for Gondolin that we can see involving the Naugrim, and we shall have to wait and see on that front. But yes, let's see what did the damage for the Naugrim here, because I would be interested to see this. Miners of Naugrim doing pretty well on occasion, considering they're rather basic. Beast Hunters, I mean, they did quite well actually for Tundra's Fox. I mean, considering the fact that for the most part we were talking about, or I was talking about, how they seem to be rather run-of-the-mill. They seem to do okay, but then bear in mind Tundra's Fox was also largely going up against Angband, who have got more numerous units of lower quality anyway, the kind of thing that the Beast Hunters are going to be better against. Dragon Slayer's doing decently enough. Iron Legion Engineers, Chariots of course, crossbow bolts doing a large amount of damage before then, charging in and ultimately being overrun. Plenty of axe throwers as well, so differing fates. As for Farkin, Lifewood Hewers, not as much as maybe you'd like. Lifewood Pikemen, however, proving to be very, very important, as I'm sure anytime we see Naugrim in the future, Pikemen and Halberdiers, one of the two or both, are going to be a centrepiece in how they're going to try and do their business, being the infantry-focused powerhouses that they are. Iron Guardsmen, I was unsure about the way Farkin was conducting the use of his Iron Guardsmen. I don't think it would have mattered in the long run, but again, we shall see. In future battles, whether front-loading your defence is going to be the better option. Iron Halberdier is doing very well though, 409 kills on one of the units there, so again, that phalanx focus proving to be something to look out for in the future as well. Iron Halberdier is doing nicely for Captain Gervais as well. The High Thanes, like I said, not really used to their fullest potential, I don't think. But oh well, rest of the units. Iron Arbalists not getting the most kills either, but they're going up against elves, so it's kind of hard to judge from pure numbers alone. But again, we shall see over the course of the further 2 battles I have, really, where the Naugrim fall. But a nice little debut battle this for them. Very elongated siege, which is the kind of thing they should do quite well in, generally speaking, of course. The next one will be a field battle, which, again, we shall see how well the Naugrim manage to do in an environment which maybe is not ideally suited for their roster, but we'll see how they try and mitigate that with what units they have. And finally, of course, a siege of Gondolin, where they will be on the defence once again. It'll be interesting to see again in another siege battle, which is maybe a little bit more varied in terms of the actual defensive positions that they can take up, whether they can really lay down their expertise there as well. But yes, big thank you to Lord of Balagos for pointing this one out, and big thank you to Tundra's Fox for having the foresight to save the replay as well and post it up on the Silmarillion Discord. And yeah, like I said, a couple more Silmarillion replays on the way, highlighting the Naugrim. A few more Reforged replays as well. We'll be continuing with the brackets that we've started to do in Reforged as well. Next one likely to be armour-piercing shock infantry. Not entirely sure what that's going to be. And of course, at some indeterminate point, hopefully in May, we'll be doing a follow-up live stream which will focus a little bit more on the topics I talked about in my latest channel update video a week or so ago. And hopefully by then I will have a little bit more information on some of the topics that I talked about in that channel update. And in a live stream format, of course, it can be a little bit more Q&A like. So that's the plan for the immediate future, which will take us about a month and a half in the future past this particular battle. So yeah, in the short term at least, the die is cast. Hope you enjoyed this, and I hope you'll join me for whatever is next.